Welcome back to Unpolished but Called. By the time Friday rolls around, most of us are carrying more than we realize. The week has done what weeks tend to do. Things didn't resolve the way we hoped. Prayers didn't get answered quickly. Growth didn't show up on a timeline we could track. And if we're honest, there's usually a quiet temptation by Friday to wonder whether anything is actually happening at all. So this episode is for that wondering. It's for the part of us that believes God is working, but wishes he'd work faster. For the part of us that trusts him, but still feels discouraged by how slow change seems to come. For the days when faith isn't falling apart, but it's also not producing visible results we can point to. So today we're talking about the slow work of God, about formation that takes time, about learning how to live with patient hope when growth doesn't hurry and progress isn't obvious. This isn't about settling for less, it's about learning how God actually works. Most of us don't struggle with believing that God can work. We struggle with how slowly he often chooses to do it. There's a gap between what we know in our heads and what we experience in our bodies. And that gap can be exhausting. We believe God is faithful, but we also live inside time, and time has a way of making us anxious when nothing seems to be changing. The slow pace of God doesn't usually make us doubt his existence, it makes us question his timing. We don't wake up thinking God has abandoned us. We wake up wondering whether we misunderstood him, whether we heard him clearly, whether we missed something that would have moved things along by now. That questioning doesn't come from a lack of faith. It comes from waiting longer than we expected. We live in a world that trains us to expect results quickly. Faster is framed as progress. Efficiency is praised. Productivity is rewarded. Even rest has been turned into something we're supposed to optimize. So when faith unfolds slowly, it can feel like we're doing something wrong, even when nothing is actually broken. And this tension usually shows up quietly. And we don't say God isn't working. We say, I thought this would look different by now. Or, I don't understand why this is taking so long. Or, I know God is doing something, but I can't see it yet. And those words aren't cynical, they're hopeful. Just maybe tired. What makes the slow work of God so hard to trust is that it doesn't give us much to hold on to externally. There aren't many milestones, and there's no clear moment we can point to and say, that's when everything shifted. Instead, growth tends to happen beneath the surface, quietly, without announcement or applause. And that kind of change is difficult to believe in because it asks us to trust something we can't measure. We tend to assume that if God were really at work, we would feel it more clearly. There would be noticeable movement, something we could name, or something we could show. But formation doesn't operate on a timeline we can monitor. It works more like soil than like a checklist. And nothing about soil looks productive while it's doing its most important work. See, seeds don't rush. Roots don't hurry. Depth develops long before anything breaks the surface. Most of that process happens in darkness, out of sight, where there's no feedback loop to reassure us that anything is happening at all. Oof, that's deeply uncomfortable for us. We like confirmation, visible progress. We want to know that our obedience, our prayers, our waiting are producing something tangible. And when we can't see the results, discouragement starts to creep in, even if we don't recognize it right away. We begin to wonder whether we misunderstood what God was asking of us, whether we stalled out, whether we're stuck in place while everyone else is moving forward. And that comparison happens quietly, but it has weight. Slowness starts to feel personal. But slowness is not the same thing as stagnation. See, God's pace is rarely hurried. And that isn't because he's inefficient, it's because he's intentional. Formation isn't about getting us somewhere quickly. It's about shaping who we are becoming along the way. And that shaping requires repetition, exposure, patience, and time. Quick change can modify behavior, sure. Slow formation reshapes character. And that distinction matters more than we realize. It's relatively easy to change habits for a season. It's much harder to transform the way we respond under pressure and the way we trust when we're disappointed, the way we remain steady when circumstances don't improve quickly. And those things don't shift overnight, no matter how much we want them to. So, when growth takes longer than we expected, impatience often disguises itself as concern or urgency. We tell ourselves we're just being realistic, that we're asking responsible questions, that we're trying to discern whether it's time to move on or push harder. And sometimes that's true, but other times it's just discomfort with waiting. God's slowness has a way of confronting our desire to manage the process. We may not say it outright, but the underlying tension is often this: can we trust God when we don't like his pace? Not just trust that he's good, but trust that he's wise in the waiting. That's where patient hope begins to matter. Patient hope isn't optimism. It doesn't expect everything to turn around quickly. It doesn't pretend the waiting is easy or pleasant. It simply chooses to believe that time itself is not an obstacle to God's work. And that belief doesn't come naturally. It's learned. Waiting stretches us. It exposes our need for control. It reveals how much we want outcomes on our terms and on our timeline. When progress is slow, we feel that tension more acutely because there's nothing to distract us from it. And yet, this is often where the deepest formation happens. We don't usually notice it in the moment. We notice it later, when something that used to undo us doesn't have the same power anymore. Or when our response to a familiar situation feels steadier, less reactive. Even then, we might not immediately connect that change to God's work because it happened so gradually, we barely felt it happening. That's the quiet irony of spiritual growth. The deeper it goes, the less dramatic it feels. This is why formation that takes time requires a shift in how we measure progress. If we only look for visible results, we'll miss the most of what God is doing. But if we start asking different questions, something changes. Not how fast is this changing, but who am I becoming while I wait? Waiting stops being empty space, starts becoming active ground. Not because waiting suddenly feels productive, but because God is present in it. He's shaping things we can't yet see, forming trust that isn't dependent on speed, and building something in us that will last longer than a quick fix ever could. Patient hope doesn't rush God. It doesn't pressure him to move faster. It doesn't interpret delay as indifference. It holds space for the possibility that God is doing more than we can currently understand. And that what he's doing may matter more than what we want changed right now. That kind of hope is quieter than excitement, but it's steadier, less dependent on outcomes, more anchored in trust. And for now, that steadiness is enough. By the time we reach this point, something subtle usually starts to shift inside us. Not because circumstances have changed, and not because answers have finally arrived, but because we've stopped fighting the pace. Why it's so hard? We're still waiting, still hoping, still aware that things are moving slower than we'd like, but there's a quiet realization settling in that resisting the slowness has been costing us more than the slowness itself. Waiting doesn't just test our patience. It tests what we believe growth is supposed to look like. When God works slowly, it forces us to reconsider how transformation actually happens. We're used to thinking of change as something noticeable and fairly immediate. A breakthrough, a turning point, a moment where we can clearly say, that's when things got better. But formation almost never announces itself like that. Most of the time, it happens in accumulation. Small choices layer on top of each other. Ordinary obedience repeated over long stretches of time. Showing up again and again without any guarantee that today will feel different than yesterday. None of that feels remarkable while it's happening, but it quietly reshapes us. This is where patience becomes more than endurance. It becomes participation. We're not just waiting for God to act. We're being formed while we wait. Our trust is being stretched. Our expectations are being softened. Our need for immediacy is being gently challenged. All of that is part of the work, even though it doesn't feel productive in the way we've been trained to value. The slow work of God has a way of exposing the parts of us that want to rush ahead of Him. We notice how quickly we look for alternatives when progress feels too gradual. How easily we become tempted to force outcomes or settle for shortcuts. Not because we don't trust God, but because waiting leaves us feeling vulnerable and unfinished. There's discomfort in being unfinished. We like the sense of arrival. We like closure. We like knowing we've reached some kind of milestone that proves the waiting was worth it. When formation stretches out over months or years instead of weeks, it can feel like we're stuck in the middle with no clear indication of when things will finally resolve. That's where patient hope has to deepen. Not the kind of hope that expects resolution on a specific timeline, but the kind that believes God is present and purposeful, even when resolution isn't visible yet. That kind of hope doesn't hurry God. It stays open, stays attentive. It learns to live well inside the waiting instead of constantly trying to escape it. Living well inside the waiting doesn't mean we suddenly enjoy it. It means we stop treating waiting as wasted time. We begin to notice what's actually happening beneath the surface. We notice that our reactions are changing, even if slowly. We notice that we're responding with more grace than we used to. We notice that our faith feels quieter but sturdier. Those shifts don't announce themselves loudly, but they matter. One of the hardest parts of slow formation is that it rarely gives us emotional reinforcement. We don't get frequent reassurance that we're on the right track. We don't feel constant encouragement. We're often left to trust that obedience still counts even when it doesn't feel rewarding. And that's where faith becomes less about experience and more about relationship. We stop measuring God's presence by how we feel in any given moment and start trusting that He's working, even when our emotions are neutral or discouraged. That's not a downgrade in faith, it's a deepening of it. There's a quiet strength that develops when we learn how to stay present without constant validation. We become less reactive, less dependent on immediate outcomes, less shaken when progress is slow or invisible. That strength doesn't come from trying harder. It comes from staying longer. Staying with God when nothing feels urgent. Staying with faith when nothing feels dramatic. Staying with the process even when we'd rather have a shortcut. Over time, that staying shapes us in ways that fast change never could. The slow work of God also teaches us something important about trust. Trust isn't just believing that God will eventually do what we want. It's believing that His timing is wise, even when it doesn't align with our preferences. The kind of trust isn't passive, it's active, daily, and often quiet. It shows up in the choice to keep praying, even when prayers feel repetitive. It shows up in continuing to obey in small, ordinary ways that doesn't draw attention. It shows up in resisting the urge to rush ahead simply to escape the discomfort of waiting. Over time, patient hope begins to reframe how we see progress. We stop asking, why isn't this done yet? And start asking, what is God forming in me right now? And that shift doesn't remove the longing for change, but it steadies it. We still want growth. We still want healing. We still want movement. But we're no longer panicked by the pace. And that's a meaningful change. Because panic makes us grasp for control. Patient hope allows us to release it. This doesn't mean we stop caring about our outcomes. It means we stop letting outcomes define our faith. We learn how to value faithfulness over speed, depth over immediacy, and formation over performance. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, we begin to notice that we're different. Not because everything worked out the way we hoped, but because we've become more grounded in the waiting. We're less easily undone by uncertainty. We trust God's presence more than we trust the visible progress. That kind of faith doesn't impress people. It doesn't look dramatic, but it lasts. God works in the slow, not because he's distant, but because he's careful. He's shaping something that needs time to take root. Something that won't collapse under pressure. Something that will endure beyond the season we're currently in. If we're waiting right now and feeling discouraged by how long it's taking, this needs to be said gently. The slow pace does not mean God is absent. It often means he's doing deeper work than we can see. Formation takes time, and time in God's hands is never wasted. So before we close, just a gentle note. If you want to go deeper, the books, resources connected to this podcast are all on my website under kathrinshaffer.com. That's where everything lives in one place. You can also find me on Facebook under Kathrin Shaffer. If you want to connect there, you're welcome to follow me. And there's a separate group called Unpolished for slower, more honest conversations around these themes. Everything will be there when you're ready. But if things feel slower right now, it doesn't mean nothing is happening. Remember, God does some of his most faithful work quietly over time, shaping us in ways we won't fully recognize until later. Have a wonderful weekend, friends.